On your birthday, you get to think about some of the best and most important experiences of your life. And in my life, I've been lucky to actually have the opportunity to study with David Hartman, the philosopher who came to Israel after the Six-Day War and established the Shalom Hartman Institute. There he taught in his innovative, creative, challenging way that really forced us to think about what was really important and how we could get past the feelings of the moment to understand what it really meant to be a people that stood at Sinai. But of all the things he taught me, probably the most lasting thing was, one day he said to me, "You have to meet my son." And so for 20 years, I've had the opportunity to become friends with Donniel. Donniel told me at first that it wasn't easy to be a philosopher's son. You didn't come home from school and be asked, "What did you do today?" Or "Who did you play with?" You were asked, "What is the meaning of the experience?" What questions did it stimulate inside of you? And through the years, I've seen Donniel ask the questions and challenge the status quo of Jewish life. He took the Hartman Institute to a new level, and now it serves really as an opportunity to educate Israelis, whether they be youth, whether they be in the military, whether they be in the political process, or whether they just be citizens, to understand what it really means to live in a state with Jewish values. He's expanded the program to Jews throughout the world, and of course, many of us study here of the materials and the ideas of the Hartman Institute. And he's included in that study not only the best and brightest of American rabbis, but he's included in study at the Hartman Institute religious leaders from the Muslim and Christian communities, because in so many ways we all live following the same narrative. This capacity to deal with the Jewish issues today and the opportunities that we have and the challenges we face in being in the public space openly and sovereignly is really a challenge that needs to be looked at and investigated from a Jewish perspective. And no one is better able or put more into it or offered more ideas than our friend, Rabbi Donniel HARTMAN.
Good evening. Stand with Israel. That's not just merely a banner. Everybody who's here tonight takes that and sees that as a core, self-evident feature of who they are as Jews. You would not be here tonight, and JUF, even though it works here, it works overseas, it works in Israel. No organization in the United States more symbolizes and more collectively focuses the Jewish community on this idea of stand with Israel. And I'd like to talk tonight about standing with Israel. But I don't want to talk to any of you. I want to talk, and I want you to talk and to think, what do we need to do so that in 10 years' time, or in 20 years' time, there'll be somebody in this room. For you, standing with Israel is self-evident. For us, it's what it means to be a Jew. We don't pick it. We don't have any great dilemma. The only question we have to ask is how much I should give, not if I should give. If, that's self-evident. To stand with Israel, of course, who would I stand with? Who else would I stand with? Those features are self-evident to everybody in this room. But if you truly love Israel, one of the questions that we have to put on the table is how do we make sure that this idea has a future? And one of the things that everybody in this room knows is that you make a great error if you believe that that which is important to you will be self-evident in the future. If we've learned anything about contemporary Jewish life, is that nothing is self-evident. If we've learned anything about contemporary Jewish life, is that anything that we cannot even imagine becomes mainstream. You care about standing with Israel? Well, you have to ask the question that the rabbis asked in Tractate Yoma when they said, what does it mean to love God? And that's it. Love God. Love God, support God, fulfill God's commandments, bow down to God, tell God how much you love God, think about God. The rabbis say, no, that's not what it means to love God. You love God when you make God beloved to others. You love Israel? Well, tonight, I'd like to talk about how you make Israel beloved to others. And those others aren't the people who aren't your peers who aren't in the room today. The others for tonight are your children and your grandchildren. And now we who love Israel have to start thinking about that question. Because our gravest danger is not from the enemies of Israel today. Our greatest danger is, are we going to have supporters within our community for Israel? And the gravest danger is not anti-Israel campaign on campus, but is indifference towards Israel amongst our children and our grandchildren. Now, Israel, the meaning of Israel, what Israel yearned to achieve and to create, from its inception, went in two different directions. There were two different core ideas as to why Israel, or when you're standing with Israel, what are you standing with, or what are you standing for? The first, I'll call continuity Zionism, or survival Zionism. And the second, as coined by Echad Ha'am, cultural Zionism. What are these two ideas? The first core idea of Zionism was, it's simply not safe to be a Jew in the world. Despite emancipation and enlightenment, despite the fact that Jews were officially accepted for the first time as citizens in Western European countries, it didn't really take. It took legally, but culturally it didn't take. And by the middle of the 19th century, Jews says, if it's still impossible to live here, then it's time for us to recognize that we in fact have an existential crisis, which is not going to go away, and Jews will not be able to survive within a context of somebody else, in particular a Christian, not to speak of a Muslim state. We aren't going to make it through the 20th century. And we want to live. And so Theodor Herzl walks around, and actually in a very interesting way, gets anti-Semites to commit to Israel. And his argument is, to the Jews, this is not viable. And you know it's not viable. But we couldn't create the state on our own. So Herzl goes, and early survival Zionists go and campaign to nations of the world and say, you hate us. I have a solution for your anti-Semitism. Israel's good news for you. by you creating the state of Israel, we're not solving our problem, we're solving your Jewish problem. And Herzl, you don't like us. You don't want us to be here. We can't survive here, and you don't want us to be here. And so now we have a coalition to create a state, a place where Jews could do one simple thing. Live. No pogroms. No murder. And you will be able to tolerate us because we're not going to be in your midst. And you will invest in our enterprise because you are profoundly anti-Semitic. Zionism was necessary because of anti-Semitism and succeeds, paradoxically, because of anti-Semitism. That is continuity or survival Zionism. And that was one core idea. And it was very deep and self-evident in Jewish self-understanding. And particular after the Holocaust, like what more needed to be said? To stand with Israel and to stand for Israel was to stand for the right of the Jewish people to live. That was one idea. But while it is so self-evident and primary, it is actually, within the context of the Jewish tradition, very secondary. Because Jews never saw survival as an end unto itself. If we did, what would we do? We'd leave. Christianity and Islam were just waiting. All I had to say was the Shahadat, La ilaha illallah, Muhammadun Rasulullah, and I was safe. Say it, what's the big deal? You don't even have to speak Arabic. I could teach bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah kids. Just say, La ilaha, you don't have to say, I can teach them how to say it. Just say it and you're safe. If all you want to do is live, get out of Judaism. But Jews said, I don't want to just live. I want to live a certain way. To be a Jew is to see life as valuable, but not as an end unto itself. The end unto itself is what you do with your life. To live a life of meaning. To live a life of value. To be a holy people. To stand for something. And Ahad Ha'am puts forth the idea that if we're going to collect Jews all over the world, we're not just going to collect them here so that they could live. That's a good thing, because it's kind of hard to be a light unto the nations if you're not alive. So it's not that I'm anti-life. I'm pro-life. Jews are definitely pro-life. But I'm pro-life for a reason. And if I'm going to collect Jews around the world to the state of Israel, I don't only want to solve the problem of the Jews, I want to solve the problem of Judaism. I want to create a renaissance in Judaism. I want to create a cultural center which will give forth to values and ideas to the best of what Judaism is about. I want to create a cultural renaissance. I want to create Jewish music, Jewish language, Jewish thought. Israel is necessary because through Israel, Jews will enter into a public sphere and bring the best of a 3,000-year-old tradition together with the best of modernity to produce something of greatness. And to stand with or for Israel is to stand for that idea of Judaism, to stand for the necessity of that, to recognize the significance of creating that type of Jewish renaissance. And Israel is necessary, and Israel is valuable, not simply because here Jews could breathe, but here Judaism becomes something else. Continuity or survival, Zionism, defines Israel as the state of the Jews. Cultural Zionism defines Israel as a Jewish state. And as Jews ultimately do, And it's one of the most unique and special features of our religious tradition and our history, is that when we're given two options, what do? We take both, right? We picking, that's just too superficial. Like either or, black, white, that's not Jewish. It's just not, it doesn't fit. It's like somehow if I pick one, I don't want to be stupid. It's like, if you had a good, I want both. That's why God, the joke, God tricks us with two tablets. It's like, I want more. And so Jews take both of them and merge them together into one coherent narrative, which defines the power and significance of the state of Israel. Paradoxically, for much of Jewish intellectual thought, much of Zionist thinking, before the state, cultural Zionism was dominant. As the state comes closer to actualization, and after the state is formed, continuity or survival Zionism become more dominant. But the two always coexist. And the differences between us are not whether you're an either or, but what's more important. What do you emphasize? At which time? What carries more weight for you? Now, without doubt, and here, while many of you I know, some of you I don't, but if there is some similarity between us, there is no doubt that for many of us, we grow up on the dominance of survival and continuity Zionism. That hits us at a core. That is our first and primary motivation. That's the lens to which we understand, yes, I get it. But the challenge we face, and please remember, now let's not talk to us. We are irrelevant. Because Israel has us. The Jewish community has us. But if you love God, you worry about God's name being beloved. If you love Israel, you wonder, how do you make Israel's name beloved for the future? We're not about the 2015 campaign. Well, we are, but that's not what we're about deeply. We're about keeping this enterprise alive. And that means we have to transcend our own belly buttons. We have to transcend our own truths and put ourselves in somebody else's seat and ask what makes sense. And the great challenge that we face when we think 10, 20 years into the future, and you can already see it now, so it doesn't require any great prophetic imagination, is that the two key narratives defining Israel and defining its significance are being profoundly challenged, questioned, and undermined. Let's start with continuity or survival Zionism. And by the way, for Zionism, one of the things that we've all learned is Zionism is not an idea which is exclusively owned by Israelis. Zionism is a category which sees and values the significance of Israel for Jewish life, whether you live in Israel or whether you don't live in Israel. If you stand with Israel, you are a Zionist. Continuity or survival Zionism was absolutely essential in the early 20th century. It was absolutely critical and became even more critical before the formation of the State of Israel. If you went through Kristallnacht, you had no question. Why Israel? Did you want to live there? Would you want to be there? The answer is self-evidently no. And so how do I create a place where Jews could be safe? Israel was created so that Jews could live. But now in 2015, does survival or continuity Zionism make sense or legitimize the existence, not of Israel? The question is not why. Israel's a country like any other country. Israelis need Israel. Israelis have a right to survive just like the Jordanians or the Iraqis or the Syrians or the Canadians or the Mexicans. But you're not here because of a country which has its own. You're here because of your connection, because we speak about a global Jewish community. Why is Israel significant to you? Does continuity Zionism make sense in 2:15? Here, let's look for a second just at North America. What is the North American Jewish enterprise? We have to recognize that one of the core goals of North American Judaism is to create an alternative to continuity Zionism. You don't want to move to Israel. You say next year in Jerusalem, but you don't mean it. It's a song like all other songs. When I made Aliyah in 1971, or I was taken on Aliyah in 1971, we used to joke in the family that whenever we went, everybody was coming up to us as if we were the Kotel. Oh, you're making Aliyah, that's so wonderful. I really want to. I'm going to soon, in a few years. I just have to finish. It's like people are giving us all these, like I didn't talk. I'm just making Aliyah. Like I didn't. Everybody had to explain to us why they were not yet making Aliyah. It's like we wanted to make Aliyah just so that we wouldn't have to hear people anymore. It made our Aliyah easier, even though we were miserable. At least we said, no one's talking to us about why they're soon going to be making Aliyah. It helped our transition. I made Aliyah twice. I then moved back to the United States for 2 years and like a good Israeli stayed 11. And then in 95, I moved back. And when I moved back and I took my children back, not one single person came up to us and said to us, "Oh, you're making Aliyah? Fantastic. We're going to." There were actually 3 Israelis in the community who did talk that way. But everybody else, thank you very much. Everybody else asked us one simple question. Why? Are you crazy? The reality is, and let's be honest, because if we're not honest, we could go home and feel that Israel and the Jewish community are safe. But we're not. We're talking 10, 20 years from now. And if we're not going to be honest about who we are and understand what we've created here in America, we're not going to have a stand with Israel reality in 20 years. The reality and the goal of North American Judaism was to create an American identity for Jews. Was to create an alternative which was not possible in Europe. Was to become American Jews. Now you have to understand, if you are an American Jew, then continuity or survival Judaism, Zionism, is not even coherent. How could you speak about the fact that Jews can't be safe anywhere and live here? You can't. It's not a coherent statement. Because you're the proof to the opposite. Not only are you a proof that it is possible, that's your goal. Your goal is to be American. Those are the choices that you have made in every feature of your life. Look at this building. And one of my favorite rabbis in North America. We speak about, could you actually be in this building and feel that survival Zionism is a coherent statement? That Israel is necessary so that Jews could live? You seem to be living not too bad here. This is bigger than the temple. It's more glamorous. I wish the temple in Jerusalem would look as nice as this. I'd actually go. There's also no cows, no goats, doesn't smell.
White carpet.
White carpeting for the blood. It's like the whole thing. This is pretty good. Not too shabby, ladies and gentlemen. Could you talk about continuity Zionism in this building? It's not coherent. How can you, though? Because as human beings, we aren't coherent. And we don't need to be. Because sometimes we have personal experiences which create a cognitive dissonance in which certain ideas we're not even able to understand. When you experience the Holocaust, when you're second generation Holocaust, when you're fighting to become American but you feel it's precarious, you cannot fully integrate the values and ideas and aspirations which define who you are, so you live with a certain type of a cognitive dissonance. But that cognitive dissonance is coherent only in the context of who you are as a human being. Your life experiences make it dissonance, enable it to be coherent. I am working totally to be an American. I want to be an American. I want to create American Jewish continuity, not survival Zionism. But the experience of the Holocaust, the dangers which I or my parents experienced, are still there, that somehow I speak in survival Zionism mode, even though everything about me says that that's not what my reality is. And I live with both. In 20 years' time, ladies and gentlemen, 3 generations from the Holocaust, the number of Jews who will live with that cognitive dissonance will be close to 0. Close to 0. And if you want to speak about Israel as continuity Zionism, there will be nobody in this room. Nobody. And we will have a grand memory of a community for who stood with Israel. But we will not have a community which stands with Israel. Or at least anybody. And by then I'll be of that age, so not anybody below 75. And you and JUF and AIPAC and even J Street will be senior citizen organizations, with a small group of Orthodox and a few Christian evangelicals. Because it's not what we're trying to do. And by the way, it's not only going to shape us, and this is another issue that I don't want to speak about tonight, as a community, if we really care about Israel, we have to wake up and understand that continuity Zionism is not going to be an argument that the non-Jewish world understands either. And up till now, we are able to define the relationship to Israel through continuity or survival Zionism. And we're able to tell the world, or at least those who we talk to, and in particular Christians here in America, shh, you killed me in the Holocaust. You listen to my narrative. Christian guilt and responsibility for the Holocaust, European guilt and responsibility for the Holocaust, still define, or are just at the end of defining, why I will support Israel, or why no other issue can even enter into my discourse. Christianity went through a profound transformation in which an 1800-year-old idea, which was at the core of Christian thinking, which is the supersessionist notion that we are the new Jews, that we're the new children of Israel. We are the New Testament. You are the Old Testament. Christianity looked and said, what does that supersessionist idea mean? What did it cause us to do? And after the Holocaust profoundly began a process of reflection and tshuva, culminating in 1962 with the Second Vatican Council, in which the core notion is that God loves the followers of Jesus. But the covenant with Jesus does not replace or supplant the prior covenant with the Jewish people. It's a huge idea, which begins to take hold throughout Christendom, not just Catholicism. But because they understood their responsibility, direct and indirect, much of the larger world, why Israel? Holocaust. Why Israel? Because of my hate, because of what I did. And Jews and Christians could have profound dialogue here in America about ethics, about theology. The one thing they can't talk about is, unless you're evangelical, and even then we can't talk, but for other reasons, Israel. Because we say to them, shh. Well, you don't have a right to have a feeling. And by being a victim, paradoxically, you have profound power. Because you get to shape the narrative. And the perpetrator of the harm which you experienced feels responsible to compensate by accepting your narrative. But already now, anybody engaged in significant Jewish-Christian dialogue in America knows that there's a new generation. It's not that they don't know Joseph. There's a new generation which says, I don't hate Jews. I've never hated Jews. My parents don't hate Jews. I've never hurt a Jew. I've never thought of hurting a Jew. I actually would like to marry a Jew. I'm not responsible for the Holocaust. And frankly, I don't even understand the notion of continuity Zionism. I don't understand, because you're here. You don't need to be, I don't need to have Israel to save you from me. I'm willing to accept you. There is no Jewish problem. And so Vice President Biden could live in some cognitive dissonance experience because of a grand moment that he had with Golda Meir in the 60s. And he could convene 200 powerful Jews to his home. Because he wants Jews to help his administration, which is the antithesis of survival and continuity Zionism. And he can get up and say, we all know that we have to support Israel. Why? Because if it wasn't for Israel, there'd be no place else for Jews to go. That's what he heard from Golda Meir. But it's like, what do you mean there's no, they're just here, they're in Washington. Like, what are you talking about? What's your whole experience is that Jews are here, Jews are powerful, Jews are at home, and you're telling Jews in America who are at home, who you are kowtowing to, in the Blair House, that we need Israel because there's no other place for Jews to go? Well, if we think that argument is coherent, the whole fundamental principle of a child getting up and saying the emperor has no clothes, it's the child who says it, because we live in cognitive dissonance. We're not always coherent, but the next generation comes and saying, what are you talking about? The emperor has no clothes. Do you believe that a Christian or an average American who over and over again votes that the most respected religion in America is Judaism are going to feel that they have to support Israel because Jews have nowhere else where they can be safe? And that's the argument you're banking on? Stand with Israel? On that? And the people who are married to these non-Jews are our children. And as I say, and you and those who've heard me in the past, and some of you haven't, the reason why intermarriage is so much greater in our generation is not because Jews are less committed. It's because we live in the first generation in which non-Jews are willing to marry Jews. If that's the case, and that's what Jews experience, and that's what our kids are going to experience on campus, not merely the BDS campaign or the attack on birthright. That's there, and that's a problem, and we have to deal with it. But the prominent experience of the kid is, try doing birthright if it wasn't for free. Good luck. You pay to go to Israel. You actually donate to JUF. For you, it's a priority. If birthright cost $5, we do thing in 18 denomination. If birthright costed $18, good luck. They're gone. And try telling them that without Israel, Jews can't survive. The world's going to be dangerous. What do you mean the world's going to be dangerous? What, my mother's going to kill me? My non-Jewish grandparents are going to come for Pesach and they're going to slaughter me? Our challenge as lovers of Israel is to be honest. Our challenge as lovers of Israel is to ask, how do we raise money today, as much as we can, to deal with the challenges that we face today? But how do we also lay a foundation for a future? Continuity and survival Zionism as a foundation for standing with Israel is simply untenable and incoherent for the next generation of Jews who we hope will sit in this room. Not for you, not for me, but for them. And if you don't believe me, talk to them. Just talk. Don't tell, just simply talk. Cultural Zionism is also seriously challenged. Because cultural Zionism says Israel is going to be the place where we create a Jewish renaissance which will be, forget a light unto the nations. I'd love to be a light unto the nations, but I first want to somehow enlighten us a little bit. Light unto the nations is so pretentious, like as if we have our shop in order. Let's start with us. And cultural Zionism started with us, where Israel is supposed to be the place where the best of Judaism is represented. The best of Judaism is expressed. And therefore anybody will say, I want to stand with you, because to stand with you is to stand with the best of what we are about. It's what the Megillat Ha'atzmaut, the Declaration of Independence, declares. And says, what does it mean to be a Jewish state? A Jewish state is the place where the values of peace, justice, equality, freedom, as envisioned by the prophets of Israel, will emerge. I could stand with that. The challenge we face, though, is that that's not exactly what Israel is representing all the time. And you could blame it on public relations. But this has nothing to do with public relations. And this has nothing to do with the war in Gaza. And this has nothing to do with foreign policy. And this has nothing to do with ISIS. And this has nothing to do with Iran. If cultural Zionism means a Jewish state, there are many people for whom a Jewish state means a state in which everybody has to be Jewish like me. And by the way, not like any of you.
Yeah.
So why would any of you want to identify with cultural Zionism? There are people in Israel for whom a Jewish state means holding on to more land. Because the more land we hold, the more Jewish the state of Israel is. Which one of you would like to identify and feels inspired by that? Forget you. You, now talk 20 years down the road. Oh yes, I want to stand with what? A notion that greater Israel is defined not by the greatness of its values, but by the amount of real estate that it holds? That's going to inspire your grandchildren to say, I can't wait to go to Israel? Advocacy for Israel is core to what it means to be pro-American? Good luck. when a Jewish state means, for many, a state in which equality to non-Jews is not a value? And where Israel wants to, or some people in Israel want to be the only country in the world which wants to pass a national identity law in which equality of citizens is not mentioned. And by the way, that includes Iran and North Korea, who have national identity laws in which equality is there, but we're going to be the only one which isn't. Or a Jewish state is antithetical to democracy. Or where refugees, integration of refugees, is considered a danger to the Jewishness of Israel rather than an expression and fulfillment of the Jewishness of Israel. Continuity and survival Zionism will not put anybody in the room in 20 years' time, because the passage of time will remove the existential experience which allows for the incoherence. Cultural Zionism is the only thing that makes sense. If we as a people are going to want to unite, are going to want to feel connected to each other, not merely in moments of danger, but because there's a joint life that we want to create which inspires us to be connected to each other in moments of danger. It's only going to be because we stand for something. And a connection to Israel is only going to be important to the extent that Israel represents the best of who we are and who we want to be. But to achieve that, we have to begin to work. The first thing that we need to do, if we want to lay the foundations for people in this room in 20 years' time, is we have to begin here in North America a major conversation about cultural Zionism. The defining conversation about Israel can no longer simply be survival Zionism, it must be cultural Zionism. Which means, what does a Jewish state mean? What do you want? How do you understand what a Jewish state means? How do you understand a Jewish and democratic state? What is the Israel that you yearn for? What does it mean to have a Jewish state which represents the best of what we stand for? What does it mean? What is our foreign policy? What is our economic policy? What is our religious policy? What are our attitudes towards minorities? What is the Israel that you want? I know the Israel that I want. I know an Israel that can inspire another generation to want to be connected. It's an Israel in which Israel is more Jewish to the extent that it is more democratic. It's an Israel that's more Jewish to the extent that it treats all of its citizens equally. It's a state which is more Jewish to the extent that more Jews are able to give expression to who they are as Jews fully within the public sphere. It's a state that's more Jewish to the extent that we embrace refugees, obviously within certain numbers. That we embrace people and say, of course, that's what it means to be a Jew. To be a Jew means to love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. A Jewish state is the state where a national minority feels so loved and accepted more than any national identity in any other country. And I don't hide behind the fact and say, oh, they're worse than me, as if that constitutes a Jewish argument. Who do I want to be? But to do that, we need to create a room for that conversation in our community. If we don't talk about cultural Zionism, no one's going to want to talk about Israel. No one's going to want to think about Israel. No one's even going to want to have it on their radar screen. Now, the idea about cultural Zionism is that we get very frightened. Because while we know for sure that somewhere in the world, next year, some Jew is going to be in danger, And so somehow our argument seems safe. Cultural Zionism requires the opening of a door, the answer to which we don't know where it's going to be. And Israelis don't necessarily vote along the ideologies of cultural Zionism to which you aspire. So let's not talk about that. Let's forget cultural Zionism and remember right now what dangers Jews are in. And that's fine for 2:15. That's not going to work in 2:25 unless somewhere along the line you're praying for a mini Holocaust. Don't pray for a mini Holocaust. That's too obscene. We're not that sick that we want to create a stand with Israel, which is so valuable that we almost yearn for a perennial crisis to make sense of the ideology. Let's put it this way. And even if some of us think that way, remember, 20 years, 225 or 235, that's not going to work. In a community in which survival and continuity Zionism is all that you talk about, right now, with the exception of us in this room, nobody else wants to join the conversation. A community which talks about cultural Zionism is a community which makes room for others to begin to talk about what is the Israel you want. And you know what? Let me comfort you for a moment. And we're now, my faculty, we're in 40 campuses. We're working with thousands of college students. And I remember it from my own life. Cultural Zionism is not dependent on Israel implementing now the ultimate ideals of what we yearn for. It's about an Israel and a Jewish community which are working towards something. I could live with a gap between my aspirations and reality as long as it's clear what I'm working for. The greatness of a life is never assessed by your achievements, but by your aspirations. Are we a community which has aspirations for Israel anymore? Are we a community which puts those aspirations on the table, front and center? Which creates a community which says, what does a Jewish state mean? Instead of being embarrassed by the conversation and trying to shelve it and to say, oops, let me remind you of something else. No. What is the Israel that you want? You have to develop here in North America your Torah of cultural Zionism. Your unique take on cultural Zionism. Israelis are going to have to do the same. Now, when I say to you, build a Torah of cultural Zionism, I'm not telling you, save Israel from itself. I'm not asking you to determine for Israel its future. Israel's a democracy, and Israel will vote for whoever it wants to vote. But you're part of the conversation. One of the beauties of federation, one of the great gifts that federation has given to every single one of you, this is its greatest gift, is that it gives you a seat at the table. You are part of the conversation. Through federation, you could shape what Israel is about. Do you want to? Now, for you, maybe you don't need to. Because for you, Israel is self-evident. But if you don't engage in that conversation of trying to shape Israel, then your children aren't going to want to be part of that conversation. Survival and continuity Zionism are never fully going to be irrelevant. Because the world will always be a place where some dangers will exist. There will always be a community of Jews somewhere in the world who are going to need help. And for whom Israel will be part of the solution. And so it's not an either or. But the primary engine of love for Israel, the primary engine to enable people to stand with Israel, is to feel that they have a stake in building a different type of Israel. That they are engaged in a conversation about what that Israel is about, and that they are engaged in a battle to create that Israel. When I grew up, the greatest Jewish mitzvah, or the greatest expression of my love for Israel, and I'm sorry this might not be a pro-federation statement, but it's not, is buy a tree. I remember, it was buying a tree. I remember my bar mitzvah when the sisterhood gave me a tree. It was one of the proudest moments of my life. I had a tree in Israel. Do you know, like, I had a tree. Who here had that experience? Do you remember? Wasn't it like remarkable, someone saying, you got a tree? And then if by some chance you watched Salach Shabbat, you were in trouble, because then you found out that your tree was also owned by somebody else. It was like a little problematic that they sold the same tree 40 different times and they changed the plaques when you came. But other than that, still the idea that you have a tree. Do you know what it's like? I have a tree in Israel. My friends, not you, but for the people in this room 20 years from today, we need to not merely plant trees. We need to start planting ideas in Israel. We have to start engaging in a deep and profound cultural struggle that's happening today in Israel, which influences every single one of you and which every single one of you has an opinion about. What does a Jewish state mean? What does it stand for? Put a stake, plant a stake, lay claim, not merely to the land and not merely to roots, but to what Israel may stand for. Fight for it. And it's going to be a fight. Ultra-Orthodox in Israel are cultural Zionists. They have a perspective on what a Jewish state means. National religious Zionists are cultural Zionists. They believe and have an idea of what a Jewish state should mean. Certain ardent nationalists have a perspective on what a Jewish state should mean. Nothing that any of you would want to have a part of. So let's begin. Tonight, you placed a stake in your connection and your love for Israel in 215. You made a declaration. I stand with you. I'm going to invest in you. I'm going to be there for you. But let's now do it for our children. Let's do it for our grandchildren. It's still going to require funds. And you're still going to have to make a donation. That will always be a part of Jewish life. But it's going to require more than just your funds. It's going to require your souls. It's going to require your minds. It's going to require your imagination. Imagine a Jewish community today which talks about the Israel that they want. Imagine a Jewish community today which has room for Jews to talk about the Israel they want. Today, if you want to talk about the Israel you want, by and large you have to leave the Jewish community. Because to stand with Israel means to merely say, Amen, I love you. Now that's fine for those who love it. But just like Judaism in the future is going to have to earn a place in people's lives for people to choose to be Jewish, so too is Israel. And it's your job as lovers of Israel to help Israel earn it. I love Israel. I made Aliyah twice. How many people do you know who made Aliyah twice? It's like you can't. I made it twice. I can't imagine any other place that I would want to live. Do I love everything that Israel is doing now? Am I happy after each and every election? Not necessarily. But my love for Israel is defined by my commitment to shape it and to give it a new future. As lovers of Israel, my bracha to you and my prayer to you, my prayer to you, is that use those institutions, whether it's your synagogues, whether it's other organizations, whether it's the umbrella organization, which defines what it means to love Israel and to care for it and to stand with it. Use those platforms. Not merely to raise funds today. Use that platform so that in 20 years' time, my daughter could be invited to give a speech here today. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to take a few questions tonight because clearly this is not a dialogue that's going to be resolved in this room or in the Jewish world tonight. But I just want to add one thing to create an opportunity, at least for more dialogue with Donniel. That is, it's going to be at AITZ HAYIM, and North Shore is, of course, going to be part of coming. So the times he's going to be speaking are tomorrow evening at 8 o'clock. You know, I want to be very, I want to be very respectful of what everybody's schedules is and what everybody's doing. And then there's Shabbat morning at 10:15 when he'll be speaking. And then I think the time that's certainly the purest to continue this dialogue would be after lunch at around 1 o'clock on Shabbat afternoon. And that'll be a chance because I can't imagine there aren't questions beyond the questions tonight that will be part of the dialogues. So I want to make those opportunities available to everybody in all communities so we can all share in this and facilitate more points of view coming together. But are there any questions?
Yes, please, sir. And I'll repeat the question, so. Oh, thank you.
Thank you. I personally do love Israel. I've been to Israel on my own and at my own cost, probably around 10 or 12 times.
God bless you.
But I would like to understand a bit better what you have been telling us tonight, and for that purpose I would appreciate a definition from your standpoint, and as well, the definition for what is a Jew in terms of a Jewish state and the future of Judaism in Israel. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for that question. And I'm going to answer it, but I'm first going to tell you that my answer is irrelevant. But because the reason why my answer is irrelevant is that I only want to answer it not because my opinion counts, but because what it means to stand with Israel is for every one of you to develop your Torah as to what that answer means. That every one of you should understand, of course, what is a Jewish democratic state? A, B, C, D, and E. And it's particularly challenging in the context of North America, particularly the United States, where the notion of some form of separation between church and state is at the core of what you understand democracy to be. So there's a challenge. It's not a simple issue. It means it's going to take work from you. It means that there isn't, I'm going to tell you what I think. Because I can't control myself, and I'm a rabbi, and I have just so many things that I feel I have to say, so, and it's just so important I have to tell you. But I want to tell you from the outset, I'm irrelevant. I'm just part of a group of teachers who you have to bring, and you have to think, and you have to challenge, both internally. It's your rabbis. You have the resources here. Your rabbis, what does a Jewish state mean to you? Because if you don't have an answer to that question, you can only stand with Israel within the context of continuity and survival Zionism. Because then you say, I don't understand what it means, but I can't afford to ask the question now. And that's okay today, but it won't work in 20 years' time. Now, for me, a Jewish state, I actually believe that the Declaration of Independence has a pretty good answer. The only problem is most Jews don't know it, and those who know it don't accept it. So we have an educational challenge on our hands. But the Declaration of Independence states that a Jewish state is first a homeland of the Jewish nation, because Judaism is not just a religion, it's a people. And that a Jewish nation, a Jewish state, is not parallel to a Christian or a Muslim state, it's parallel to an Irish and a French state. Now that sounds like an answer, but it actually will require about 30 hours to talk about that issue. But that's what we need to do. We're not just gonna, it's not a slow, the advantage of continuity in survival Judaism is that if it just sort of sits on you, you get it. This is going to require work. But the next feature of a Jewish state is not the state of Judaism, I would say, but it's a place where Jewish values, the best of Jewish values, define and shape the public sphere. Not Jewish law, not one denomination, but the best of Jewish values. But here comes the kicker and the problem. My notion of what the best of Jewish values is about and somebody else's notion aren't necessarily the same. So not only do we have to engage in an understanding of the issue, we now have to engage in a struggle to make sure that the best actually prevails. That's the process of building a state. When you get to build a shul, you build a shul with those people who agree with you. And if people really don't agree with you, they leave your shul. But the state of Israel, you don't have to engage in a profound debate with orthodoxy. You don't like my rabbi? Go build another, go somewhere else. We don't really belong together in some sense. In Israel, we have a cultural war because we all have to find out how we share and live within the state together. And we have to make sure that the best of what we stand for is expressed. And we have to do so not in perfect, safe conditions, like here in North Shore or Highland Park. How do we create a place where Jewish values of sensitivity and kindness and respect exist in an environment in which you feel threatened? How are you committed to the idea that every human being is created in the image of God? That all people are equal, which is a core Jewish idea. How do you maintain that in the midst of an environment where somebody wants to kill you? Because it's very easy to hate them. Now, it's okay to hate, and it's okay to fight, but when you believe that your life has greater value than someone else's, that's when you shift it in another. How do we remain the best of who we are in an environment and in a neighborhood which is morally mediocre at best? How do we make sure that we don't come back to the Middle East and become a Middle Eastern phenomenon? These are things that we're going to have to fight on. It's not going to be simple. And since the Second Intifada, Israelis have constantly and consistently been shifting in the wrong direction, and while psychologically I can understand them and send all of them to Mark for therapy, but that's not going to help me at the end of the day. I understand why you're making your decisions, but it's not good enough. Because for cultural Zionism, it's not enough that I understand why you're failing. You have to start to succeed. And so on the one hand, I answered your question a little bit. A Jewish state is not a state of Judaism. It's a state where the Jewish people, like any other nation, like France and Ireland, have a right to express their sovereign identity. And it's a place where the best of Jewish values, of peace, equality, freedom, decency, kindness, charity, morality, justice, all define, pluralism, all define the public sphere. And where those best ideas create an environment which is truly worthy of being a light. That's what I think it means. But between what I think it means and what you know it means is a lot of work. And between what I and you might think it ought to be and creating such a country is even more work. But that conversation and that enterprise, I promise you, is one that'll put people in this room in 50 years' time, not just in 20. Because to fight for that, to fight to create that, is to live a meaningful life and a worthwhile life, to live a Jewish life. I hope that was adequate, and I wish you great luck, and I wish this community great luck in this enterprise. Yes, please.
Thank you. So
So you talked about continuity survival Judaism, or Zionism. You talked about cultural Zionism. The third side maybe is religious Zionism, has its own meaning. But is there a fourth side, and did you think about this, or I'll put it out for you to think about, of civic Zionism? And what that means, you talked about in your answer to the last question, public square. How do we define the public square? And taking it a step further, how do we define the public square together between Zionists in Israel and Zionists around the world?
Great question, and it makes you aware that you have a code. For me, the word cultural Zionism includes all three. And the reason why I use the word cultural and why Ahad Ha'am used it is because you want something broader than what religious or cultural Zionism means. How do Jewish values and Jewish ideas shape and define our public and private lives? So it includes the civic, it includes the political, it includes the religious. Cultural is not, it's not a narrow notion of culture in the sense of like we have values and then we have culture, and culture is music and language. No, it's the broadest sense of culture, of being a culture, of a civilized, of creating a civilization. And so those terms, civil, like for example, what does a civil space look like? And what do you think a Jewish civil space should look like? And what does Israelis think? All of that, this is exactly the question. Now imagine these questions are fascinating. These questions are challenging. These questions are difficult. This is the debate and conversation that I want this Jewish community to have. And frankly, when I travel high and low in the North American Jewish community, the official Jewish community is not engaged in this conversation at all. And very often, it's precisely those who love Israel who are quieting this conversation. Who are saying, shh, Reform rabbis, shh, I know you're not happy, but if you love Israel, don't talk right now. Don't give expression, shh, don't talk about what your problems are. The opposite. It's precise. You have to be the leaders of this cultural, civil, religious, I'm using culture in the broader sense. And so those are you're just helping to shape the parameters, and the parameters are great, and the parameters are challenging, and the parameters aren't clear, because we're doing something new. We knew how to be Jewish 3,000 years ago. We knew how to be Jewish when we didn't have political power. How do you now be Jewish when you have political power? How do you create a great Jewish sovereign country? That's a worthwhile question. So thank you. Yes, please, sir.
Your words tonight I found very provocative and very profound. And I don't know that we should intend to just say that we need to do it individually, because I'm wondering, what is Israel like if the Israelis themselves aren't doing it, and how profound and provocative does it become within Israel and within the people of Israel?
Again, first of all, thank you for each one, such great questions. And first of all, Israelis are also asking that question. Now, there is no doubt that our Prime Minister today resonates more to the language of continuity survival Zionism. And the reason why, and he's successful in why he was elected, is because in the balance between the two, Israelis right now feel that continuity survival Zionism is the key question. And by the way, it's not Iran that Israelis are worried about. Iran was number 10 on the issues that Israelis voted for. 10. Cottage cheese. The price of cottage cheese was more important to Israelis than Iran, which is interesting. But what worries Israelis is not Iran, it's the fact that now we are facing terrorists who have the ideal terror weapon. A weapon that cannot destroy us, but that can, at will, change our lives and bring our society to a standstill. They don't have to amass an army. All they have to do is to think. Go to the store, go to the doctor, go fishing, fire a missile. That's all they have to do. Missile costs $100. So, boop. It's in my backyard. And the minute they fire it, it succeeds in terrorizing, not killing, not destroying. You could go to Sderot 4 million times. Israel is not in danger from Hamas. Israel is terrorized by Hamas. It's a big difference. But Israel faces now an enemy that it cannot defeat in the battlefield. And that makes Israelis feel insecure. The Middle East is not a very stable environment. Israelis are not interested in dramatic political resolutions in an environment which they believe is like quicksand, in which they don't know any resolution that you sign today, whether it'll even be coherent tomorrow. Oh, you could come up with security arrangements on the Jordan Valley, which makes sense for a strong monarchy in Jordan. You don't know if in 3 months' time ISIS doesn't control Jordan. You have no idea. And anybody who tells you they know is a fool. And anybody who tells you, don't worry, the world won't let that happen, we're not that impressed. So Israelis feel political instability. In the midst of that political instability, survival and continuity Zionism become more dominant. But it doesn't mean that cultural Zionism is still not part of the conversation. Netanyahu himself, for which he doesn't get credit, is the primary individual who stopped over the last 2 years every non-democratic legislation that the Knesset tried to pass. Every one. He was the one who said no. And while all the resolutions got tremendous press, they didn't get passed. And they didn't get passed because Netanyahu didn't let them get passed. So he's also not an either-or. Part of our challenge, part of my challenge, part of the challenge of hundreds and hundreds of educational institutions in Israel is how do we bring to the fore these type of ideas and questions in the midst of a very, very different and difficult environment. It's not easy. It's not easy to be or to live by and to have principles and values in the Middle East. It's very difficult. But our decision, and I see you standing, and that's the sign. I got that message. Our challenge is we came back to the Middle East. Could God have given us a better piece of real estate? That's one of the greatest proofs of God's imperfection. Anybody has any doubts whether God is perfect? It's like this. What more do you need? What more do you need? This is what you gave me? And you all call this the promised land? Unbelievable. That's the best you could do for your chosen people? Anyway, I have a whole cheshbon with God. We got to talk. We have lots of things which we have to work out. But that's what we got. That's our home. Our 3,000-year-old history was there. This is where the Jewish people decided that we are going to give expression to our national identity. Now, our challenge, and that's what it means, to stand with Israel is not to stand with an Israel which is in Canada. It's not to stand with an Israel which is in Rhode Island. It's to stand with Israel which is in the Middle East. And in 20 years' time, your children are not going to be able to say, I wish Israel was somewhere else. It's going to be an Israel in the Middle East. And it's going to be the same Middle East, and it will probably be worse. And it doesn't matter whether it's Shiites or Sunnis, both of them are competing for different levels of barbarism. And we're going to have to survive in that environment. But to survive in that environment under the idea of cultural Zionism is not merely to live. To survive in that environment is to be a great people. And the meaning of love for Israel, the coalition that we build, what the foundations that Federation and synagogues and other Jewish institutions have created is a community which wants to be together. So now let's use it. Let's use it. It's going to be difficult. And it's sometimes going to be disheartening. And sometimes you're going to encounter people in Israel who you're just going to simply say, what do I need this for? But if we're prepared, if it's self-evident that to stand with Israel means to fight for the Israel you want, then no one will ever, ever have to leave the room because they feel that their aspirations have no place. They'll never leave the room because that's not what Israel is, because they will know that to stand with Israel means to have space and a voice and power to work for the Israel you want. That's a different conversation. And I certainly hope that we'll have the wisdom, the courage, and the love for Israel to engage in such a conversation. It was a pleasure being with you today.